1984 in the quiet town of Chardon, Ohio, a place most people would describe as peaceful, small, and safe. Nestled in Geiger County, about 30 miles east of Cleveland, Chardon was the kind of place where the high school football team played under bright lights every Friday night, where neighbors knew one another by name, and where tragedy felt like something that only happened far away, on television, not here. But beneath the calm surface of that town, inside a boy growing up within it, something darker was forming. TJ Lane was not a name anyone in Chardon would have remembered before February 27, 2012. He was quiet, almost invisible. A small, thin teenager, often dressed in dark clothing, with eyes that avoided direct contact, and a presence that somehow felt both fragile and unsettling. He attended Lake Academy, an alternative school for students struggling with behavioral or academic issues. But every morning, he would board a bus that passed by Chardon High School, and it was there, one morning, that everything would change forever. Lane's life, by all accounts, was fractured long before that day. His parents, Thomas Lane Jr. and Sarah Nolan, had separated when he was young. Both had their share of trouble with the law. His father, a man known around town for his temper, had been arrested several times, charges ranging from assault to domestic violence. His mother had her own run-ins with the system. By the time TJ was a teenager, he was living with his grandparents, who were doing their best to provide stability, but even they could not erase the past that had already shaped him. At Lake Academy, teachers described him as polite, even kind, a student who rarely spoke out of turn, who sometimes helped classmates with their work. But there were others who noticed the contradictions. The sudden silences, the odd drawings, the way he seemed detached from the world around him. Some classmates later said they'd seen his Facebook posts, short, cryptic, and dark. One post read like a poem. "In a time long since, a cold wind blows. I'm the wind, and I bring the storm." It didn't make much sense to most people, but to TJ, it meant something. In the months leading up to the shooting, Lane had begun spending more time alone. He had friends, but few close ones. He sometimes talked about life being meaningless, about people being fake. There was no clear warning sign, no note, no direct threat, but the tension within him was quietly building. On the outside, Chardon High School continued with its daily rhythm. Winter was slowly loosening its grip on Ohio, but the mornings were still cold. Students would gather inside the cafeteria before class, waiting for the bell, talking, laughing, planning their day. Teachers prepared lesson plans. The day was supposed to be ordinary. But for TJ Lane, February 27, 2012, had already been decided. That morning, around 6:30, he got ready in near silence. His grandparents had no idea what was about to happen. He wore a gray pullover, jeans, and carried a small backpack. Inside that backpack was a Ruger .22 caliber semi-automatic handgun, a box of ammunition, and a knife. He left the house just like any other morning, got into the car, and rode towards school. He didn't attend Chardon High, but the school was part of his morning route. His bus stopped there to transfer students to other campuses. The sun was just beginning to rise when he arrived. The air outside was sharp and cold. Students were gathering in the cafeteria, talking about upcoming exams, sports practice, weekend plans. No one noticed the quiet boy standing off to the side. No one paid attention to the way his hands stayed buried in his pockets, the way his eyes scanned the room, expressionless. He stood there for a few minutes, motionless, as if waiting for some invisible signal. And then, without warning, he pulled out the handgun. The first shot echoed through the cafeteria like thunder. Screams followed instantly. Students dove to the ground, some trying to crawl beneath tables, others running toward the doors. In those few seconds, everything that had once been normal in Chardon, everything safe and predictable, shattered. But that moment, that explosion of violence, wasn't random. Lane moved deliberately, firing at a group of students sitting together near a cafeteria table. Among them were Daniel Parmertor, Russell King Jr., and Demetrius Hewlin, 3 young men with their whole lives ahead of them. Lane fired 10 rounds in total before fleeing the building. Witnesses later said his face showed no emotion. He didn't shout. He didn't say anything at all. He just fired, one bullet after another, and then walked out. The entire attack lasted less than 1 minute. But in that minute, 3 people lost their lives, 3 others were wounded, and an entire town was changed forever. Inside the school, panic spread like wildfire. Teachers rushed to lock doors, students called their parents, alarms blared through the hallways. One teacher, Joseph Ricci, had just started his math class when he heard the first shots. Without hesitation, he ordered his students to lock down. Moments later, he heard moaning in the hallway. A student, shot and bleeding. Ricci opened the door, pulled the wounded teenager inside, and used his belt to stop the bleeding until paramedics arrived. Down the hall, assistant football coach Frank Hall was running toward the sound of gunfire. Hall, a massive man with a soft heart, had been mentoring students for years. Without thinking about his own safety, he charged toward the cafeteria. Witnesses say he confronted Lane, yelling, "Stop!" Lane turned, fired, but missed. Hall kept running, chasing him through the doors, out into the parking lot and into the snow. Lane, startled, dropped the weapon and fled into the woods. It was 7 a.m. and 30 minutes. Within minutes, law enforcement from across the county flooded the area. SWAT teams, ambulances, and police units surrounded the school. Helicopters circled overhead. Students were evacuated, hands raised, some sobbing, others silent in shock. The images from that morning would soon play on every national news network. Meanwhile, TJ Lane was on foot, moving through the wooded area near Chardon Township. He eventually entered a small road where a police officer spotted him. Lane didn't resist. He was calm, almost eerily so, as officers handcuffed him and read him his rights. He didn't ask why he was being arrested. He didn't say he was sorry. When questioned later, Lane gave little explanation. He claimed he didn't even know the students he shot personally. To this day, no clear motive has ever been proven. Some speculated he acted out of rage. Others believed it was deep psychological distress. But the truth is, perhaps, no one will ever really understand what led that boy, just 17 years old, to walk into a cafeteria that morning and open fire. In the aftermath, the town of Chardon gathered at the local square, holding candles, praying, and crying together. The snow that night fell gently on the steps of the courthouse. Across the country, people asked the same question they always ask after tragedies like this one. Why? But in Chardon, that question wasn't rhetorical. It was personal. Parents waited outside hospitals, hoping their children would survive. Teachers stared at empty desks. Friends wrote letters they would never get to send. And the quiet town that once believed tragedy couldn't happen here would never see itself the same way again. And somewhere in a cold interrogation room, a 17-year-old sat in silence, staring at the floor, saying nothing. It was 7 a.m. and 30 minutes, the minute that changed everything. The cafeteria at Chardon High School was filled with sound. Laughter, the rustle of backpacks, the tapping of trays, the soft murmur of sleepy students waiting for first period to begin. Steam rose from cups of hot chocolate. The smell of breakfast pizza lingered in the air. It was just another Monday morning, cold and gray, with snow still piled outside along the sidewalks. Inside, the students gathered like always near the long tables. Some played on their phones, some joked about the weekend, others tried to finish homework before the bell. Among them were 5 friends: Daniel Parmertor, Russell King Jr., Demetrius Hewlin, Nate Muller, and Nick Woljak, sitting together, talking about class schedules, about college, about life after graduation. At the same moment, just a few feet away, TJ Lane stood near a bench, watching. He didn't look angry. He didn't look scared. He simply looked detached. Witnesses later said he stood motionless for several seconds, head tilted slightly, as if lost in thought. And then, suddenly, the sharp crack of a gunshot shattered the noise of the room. For a split second, no one moved. The sound was so out of place that several students thought it was a prank, a dropped textbook, maybe something falling. But then came another shot, and the screams began. The .22 caliber Ruger pistol in Lane's hand popped again and again, its echo bouncing off the tiled walls and metal tables. The small caliber rounds didn't sound like the thunderous blasts of a larger weapon, but they were deadly just the same. Each shot sent chaos rippling through the room. Daniel Parmerter, just 16, was hit first. He collapsed instantly, struck in the head. The second and third bullets hit Russell King Jr. and Demetrius Hewlin. Another hit Nick Waldzak, who fell to the ground, paralyzed from the waist down. Nate Muller, grazed by a bullet across the ear, turned in horror to see his friends on the floor. He screamed for everyone to run. Students dove beneath tables, overturned chairs, crawled toward exits. Someone yelled for a lockdown. Others pulled out phones calling 911. The cafeteria, seconds ago filled with chatter, became a storm of panic and confusion. One teacher, Tim Armelli, burst into the room shouting for students to get down. He'd heard the first gunshot from the hallway. Moments later, he saw Lane raise the pistol again. Armelli turned and ran, guiding others away, yelling, "Go! Go! Go!" Lane continued firing, expressionless, his hand steady. The entire attack, from the first shot to the last, lasted only 24 seconds. But in those 24 seconds, 5 students had been hit, 3 fatally, and dozens of others would carry the trauma for life. When the gun jammed, Lane hesitated for a brief moment. That was when assistant football coach Frank Hall appeared. Hall was a large man, 6'2", nearly 300 pounds, a father figure to many. He'd heard the gunfire and sprinted toward it, not away from it. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice booming through the hallway. Lane looked up, eyes cold, unblinking. Hall charged forward without hesitation. Lane raised the gun, fired once, missed, and turned to run. Hall chased him through the doors and into the snowy parking lot. For a few terrifying seconds, it was just the two of them, a teacher risking his life and a teenager fleeing into the freezing air. Lane disappeared into the nearby woods, dropping the gun as he ran. Hall, gasping for breath, ran back to the building to make sure the remaining students were safe. He later said he didn't think, he just moved. "You hear kids screaming," he told investigators. "You go." Back inside, chaos reigned. Teachers barricaded doors. The school went into immediate lockdown. Principal Andy Fetchick made the announcement over the intercom, voice trembling but firm. Students huddled in corners, texted their parents, prayed. The first police units arrived within minutes, followed by paramedics and SWAT officers. The entire building was secured by 8 a.m. in 5 minutes. Medics rushed to the wounded. Daniel Parmerter was still alive, barely. He was airlifted to Hillcrest Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 9 a.m. in 21 minutes. Russell King Jr. and Demetrius Hewlin were taken to Metro Health Medical Center in Cleveland. Both died within the next 24 hours. Outside, hundreds of parents gathered behind police tape, faces pale with fear, waiting for names, waiting for answers. Snow continued to fall, covering the footprints in the parking lot, covering the bloodstains that dotted the pavement. Meanwhile, officers spread out through the woods, searching for the suspect. At 8 a.m. and 45 minutes, they spotted a thin teenager walking slowly near Chardon Township Road 218, about 1 mile from the school. His clothes were wet. His hands were empty. When officers shouted for him to stop, he did. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply lifted his hands and said softly, "I surrender." He was handcuffed, placed in the back of a patrol car, and driven to the Geauga County Sheriff's Office. When asked his name, he replied, "T.J. Lane." When asked why he did it, he looked out the window and said nothing. News of the shooting spread across the country within the hour. Television crews flooded into Chardon, broadcasting live from the snow-covered lawn of the high school. Reporters spoke in hushed tones, describing the scene as heartbreaking, senseless, unthinkable. But for the people who lived there, words weren't enough. At St. Mary's Church, just down the street, people gathered to pray. The crowd grew so large that others stood outside in the cold holding candles. The town of fewer than 6,000 suddenly became the focus of national mourning. Vigils were held every night for weeks. Back in custody, investigators tried to piece together Lane's motive. They discovered the gun had been taken from his uncle's barn. The .22 caliber Ruger belonged legally to his grandfather. Lane had taken it without permission the night before. On his phone and Facebook page, detectives found vague messages written in the days leading up to the shooting. dark, poetic notes about pain, silence, and death. But there was no clear explanation, no manifesto, no warning that could have stopped what happened. Psychologists who later examined him described a disturbed mind, intelligent but fractured, isolated, detached from empathy. One psychiatrist would later testify that Lane showed signs of severe antisocial behavior and possibly emerging psychopathy, though he had never been diagnosed prior to the attack. At Chardon High, grief counselors filled the halls. Classes were canceled for a week. When students finally returned, they passed by 3 empty desks, covered with flowers, photographs, and handwritten notes. One sign read, "We will never forget you." Another said simply, "Love beats hate." The names of the victims were spoken over the loudspeakers every morning for months. Daniel Parmerter, 16, funny, hardworking, a boy who loved video games and dreamed of becoming a computer repair technician. Russell King Jr., 17, a football player, known for his big smile and plans to join his father's company after graduation. Demetrius Hewlin, 16, quiet but kind, someone who volunteered at his church and always held the door open for others. Each name carried weight, a story, a future stolen. Across the nation, the Chardon shooting reignited the debate over school safety and gun control. It became another marker in the long list of tragedies that America seemed unable to stop. Columbine, Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, and now Chardon. But for those who lived it, the story wasn't about politics or policies. It was about the people who were gone. As days turned to weeks, the funerals came, one after another. The sound of church bells, the sight of caskets, the tears of friends hugging in the cold March wind. The entire town wore red and black, the school colors, as a symbol of unity and remembrance. And through it all, T.J. Lane remained silent. He didn't cry. He didn't apologize. He sat in his cell, staring at the floor, while the world outside tried to make sense of something that would never make sense at all. When the sound of gunfire tore through the hallways of Chardon High School, chaos and bravery collided in a way no one could have predicted. For every scream, every moment of terror, there were people who ran toward danger instead of away from it. People who would later be called heroes. Not because they were trained for this, but because instinct, courage, and love for their students left them no other choice. Inside the building, as the echoes of gunshots faded, assistant football coach Frank Hall moved like a force of nature. He didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for backup. The moment he realized what was happening, he sprinted straight toward the cafeteria. His shoes pounded against the linoleum, the sound of his breathing heavy, his heart racing. In front of him, a cloud of smoke hung in the air, the sharp smell of gunpowder thick and suffocating. He saw bodies on the floor. He saw blood. And then he saw him. The shooter, a small boy in a gray pullover holding a pistol, standing still among the chaos he had created. Hall shouted, "Stop! Put it down!" His voice echoed through the cafeteria. Lane turned, raised the gun, and fired. The bullet missed, ricocheting off a wall. Hall ducked behind a table, then surged forward again. "Get out! Go!" he yelled to the students, still frozen in shock. As Lane turned to flee, Hall chased him through the doors, out into the snowy parking lot. The cold air hit his lungs like ice. He kept running. Lane, thin and fast, disappeared into the tree line behind the school. Hall stopped only when he was sure the shooter was gone, that his students had a chance to survive. Later, when asked why he ran toward the gunfire, Hall said quietly, "Those were my kids. You don't think, you just go." Back inside, another teacher, Joseph Ricci, had just begun his first period math class when the shots rang out. The sound was unmistakable. He immediately shouted, "Lock down!" His students, terrified, pushed desks against the door. Then Ricci heard something, a faint, pained moaning coming from the hallway. Against every instinct for self-preservation, he opened the door. A wounded student, bleeding heavily, lay on the floor. Ricci pulled the boy inside, locked the door again, and began applying first aid using his own belt as a tourniquet. For 10 long minutes, until police arrived, he kept pressure on the wound, talking softly to keep the student awake. "You're gonna be okay," he whispered. "Just breathe, stay with me." Those minutes felt like hours, but that act of calm, that decision to open the door, likely saved a life. Throughout the school, similar moments were unfolding. Teachers leading children into corners, whispering prayers, telling them to stay silent. In one classroom, a student texted his mother, "Mom, there's a shooter. I love you." She texted back, trembling, "Stay down. Don't move." By 8 a.m., the first officers arrived, weapons drawn, moving room to room. The sound of radios crackled through the halls. Outside, parents gathered behind yellow police tape, frantic, desperate for news. Snow was falling harder now, turning the ground white, covering the bloody footprints that marked the path of panic. The emergency response was swift and massive. More than 100 officers from multiple departments converged on Chardon. Ambulances lined the street. SWAT teams entered the school. Every student was searched, hands raised, before being escorted out to safety. The parking lot turned into a scene of controlled chaos. Medics working on stretchers, reporters arriving with cameras, and the unmistakable hum of disbelief hanging in the air. Inside a nearby house, police were receiving tips. A witness had seen a young man running through the woods behind the school. Officers spread out in a wide perimeter. At 8 a.m. and 45 minutes, a Geauga County Sheriff's deputy spotted movement near Wooden Road, a boy walking slowly along the tree line. The deputy raised his weapon and shouted, "Stop!" The boy froze. It was TJ Lane. He wasn't carrying the gun anymore. His clothes were damp, his hands empty. When officers surrounded him, he didn't resist. He didn't try to explain. He simply said, "I surrender." Within minutes, he was taken into custody and driven to the county sheriff's office. There, under bright lights and the hum of an old ventilation fan, investigators began to question him. Lane sat silently at the table, staring at his hands. When asked why he did it, he said softly, "I don't know." As officers dug deeper, they discovered the gun he used, a Ruger .22 caliber semi-automatic, had been taken from his uncle's barn. He'd stolen it the night before. He had also taken a box of ammunition and a knife, both found near the area where he was captured. He had planned it, at least in part, but no note, no explanation, no specific motive could be found. By the afternoon, his name was everywhere. TJ Lane, age 17. The phrase appeared on every television screen, every newspaper headline, every breaking news alert. For the first time, Chardon, a town most people had never heard of, was on every major network in America. Back at the school, the cleanup had already begun, though the emotional wounds were far from healing. Investigators marked bullet holes, collected shell casings, photographed the blood-stained floors. In one corner of the cafeteria, a student's backpack still lay open, a half-eaten sandwich beside it. As night fell, the snow stopped. Silence returned to Chardon, but it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was heavy, suffocating. Across town, families gathered around kitchen tables, staring at empty chairs. The Parmertors, the Kings, the Hewlands, all facing the unimaginable reality that their children were gone. In the days that followed, Chardon became a town united in grief and strength. Candlelight vigils filled the town square. The community center overflowed with people bringing food, blankets, anything they could offer. Students painted murals, hung banners, wrote letters. They called themselves One Heartbeat, a phrase that became the town's rallying cry. Frank Hall, the man who had charged the gunman, became a symbol of that strength. He returned to school only days later, walking the same halls where the shooting had happened. Students hugged him, thanked him, cried in his arms. But Hall would later admit that he carried the weight of that day for years. Nightmares, guilt, the constant question of whether he could have done more. In a later interview, he said, "People call me a hero, but I couldn't save them all." That's something you never forget. Meanwhile, prosecutors were preparing the case. Because Lane was 17, there was debate over whether he should be tried as a juvenile or as an adult. After careful review, the court ruled that the severity of his crimes warranted an adult trial. The charges were filed: 3 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of attempted aggravated murder, and 1 count of felonious assault. His first court appearance was brief. Dressed in a bulletproof vest, Lane stood silently as the judge read the charges. Reporters filled the room, cameras flashing. Outside, protesters held signs demanding justice. Inside, the parents of the victims sat motionless, eyes fixed on the boy who had destroyed their lives. In that moment, Lane looked up, his expression blank. One journalist later described his face as cold, distant, almost detached from reality. And that blankness, that absence of visible remorse, would become the most haunting part of his story. Because in the months ahead, when the trial began, the world would see not only what he had done, but who he had chosen to become. The courtroom in Geauga County was silent that morning, except for the sound of shuffling papers and muffled breathing. Reporters filled the benches, cameras lined the back wall, and parents of the victims sat clutching photographs of their children, waiting for the boy who had taken them away to walk through the door. It was March 19, 2013, 1 year and 20 days after the shooting. When Thomas T.J. Michael Lane III entered, he was wearing a white button-down shirt, his hands shackled in front of him, his hair longer now, his face still expressionless. To those who watched him walk past, he looked almost like any other teenager. But there was something else in his eyes. Something hollow, cold, detached. The trial had dragged on for months, with psychologists, investigators, and witnesses all trying to answer the same impossible question: why? Why would a 17-year-old, with no history of being bullied, no record of mental illness, no clear grievance against his victims, walk into a cafeteria and start shooting? Experts examined his background, his upbringing, his writings, his demeanor. The result was always the same. There was no single explanation, only a pattern of emptiness. Lane eventually pleaded guilty to all counts: 3 counts of aggravated murder, 2 of attempted aggravated murder, and 1 of felonious assault. The plea meant there would be no trial, no drawn-out testimony, only sentencing. Families of the victims would finally have a chance to speak directly to the one who had destroyed their lives. One by one, they stood and faced him. Mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters, each describing who their child was, what they had loved, what the world had lost. Some spoke through tears, others through anger. One parent said, "You took my son's future, his laughter, his dreams. You don't deserve to see the sunlight again." Lane listened, motionless. Then, when it was his turn to speak, he smiled. Not a nervous smile, not one of regret, a smirk, wide and cruel. He leaned toward the microphone and said, "This hand that pulled the trigger that killed your sons now masturbates to the memory. F, all of you." Then he raised his middle finger toward the families sitting in the front row. Gasps filled the courtroom. Some parents screamed. Others collapsed into tears. Deputies moved closer, ready to restrain him if necessary. But Lane simply leaned back, still smiling, as if he had won something invisible only he understood. That moment, caught on camera, broadcast across every news network, became one of the most disturbing displays of remorseless cruelty ever witnessed in an American courtroom. The image of a teenager, smirking in defiance, wearing a t-shirt with the word "killer" scribbled across the front, was burned into the nation's memory. The judge's voice shook with anger as he read the sentence: 3 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. "You have permanently harmed families, a community, and our entire society," he said. "You will spend the rest of your life behind bars." Lane showed no reaction. After sentencing, Lane was transferred to the Allen Correctional Institution in Lima, Ohio, a medium-security prison for young offenders. Officials hoped that with his age and risk level, it would be safer, but Lane's notoriety followed him everywhere. Other inmates avoided him. Guards watched him closely. He rarely spoke, rarely participated in any programs, spending most days in isolation. Over time, the attention faded. News crews moved on, and Chardon began the long, painful process of healing. The high school installed a memorial garden. The cafeteria was remodeled. The town came together every February 27th to honor the victims with a moment of silence. But then, in the fall of 2014, 2 years after his sentencing, T.J. Lane's name returned to the headlines. This time, with a word no one expected to hear again: escape. It was September 11th, 2014. At 7 p.m. and 30 minutes, Lane and two other inmates, Clifford Opperud and Lindsay Bruce, broke out of the Allen Correctional Institution. They had used a makeshift ladder of steel rods and bed sheets to climb a fence in the recreation yard. For hours, no one realized they were gone. By the time the alarm was raised, they were already in the woods beyond the prison perimeter. The news spread instantly. Helicopters, police dogs, and hundreds of officers flooded the area. Residents of Allen County were told to lock their doors, stay inside, and keep their children home. For the families of the Chardon victims, it was a nightmare reborn. The same boy who had murdered their children was loose again. By 1:1 a.m., Opperud was caught near a residential neighborhood, exhausted and covered in mud. Lane, however, had managed to slip deeper into the forest. Searchlights scanned every field, every road. Officers moved in silence, guns raised, waiting for any sound. At 1 p.m. the next day, roughly 18 hours after the escape, a police team spotted movement near State Route 309. Lane was lying face down in tall grass, shivering, his prison uniform torn. He didn't resist arrest. When asked why he ran, he simply said, "Because I could." He was returned to custody immediately and transferred to the Ohio State Penitentiary in Youngstown, a super maximum security facility built to hold the state's most dangerous inmates. There, the cells are concrete and steel, the lights never fully go dark, and every movement is watched by cameras. Lane was placed in solitary confinement, 23 hours a day in a cell the size of a walk-in closet, 1 hour for exercise in a caged yard, no contact with other inmates, no personal possessions except a few books. His meals delivered through a small slot in the door. Officials confirmed he would remain there indefinitely. One warden described him as quiet, emotionless, detached, the kind of inmate who never asks for anything. Years passed. The world moved on, but the memory of what he had done lingered like a scar on Chardon's heart. Each anniversary brought back the same questions, the same pain. Teachers who had survived still flinched at sudden noises. Students who were there carried the memories into adulthood. The screams, the smell of gunpowder, the sound of their friends falling. Frank Hall, the coach who had chased Lane from the school, continued to work in education for several years, speaking publicly about courage and trauma. But privately, he battled depression and survivor's guilt. In 2013, he left his job at Chardon High, saying he needed distance from the place that held so many painful memories. He later said, "People think time heals it, but it doesn't. You just learn to carry it." For the families of the victims, the pain never truly ended. Some created scholarships in their children's names. Others dedicated their lives to advocating for safer schools, mental health awareness, and prevention. Every year, they gathered at the Memorial Garden, lighting candles, reading names, and standing together in the cold Ohio air. In 2022, 10 years after the shooting, hundreds returned to Chardon High for a memorial service. The names, Daniel Parmerder, Russell King Jr., and Demetrius Hewlin, were spoken aloud once more. The crowd stood in silence for 3 minutes, one for each life lost. Today, T.J. Lane remains in the Ohio State Penitentiary in Youngstown, confined to his small cell, serving 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. He is 31 years old now, his youth long gone, his name forever linked to the tragedy he caused. No one visits him. No one speaks his name in Chardon anymore, except in whispers. His face has vanished from the news, but his shadow still lingers. In every empty seat in that cafeteria, in every classroom drill, in every parent's silent fear when their child walks out the door each morning. And though the years have passed, the echoes of that cold February morning, the gunshots, the screams, the courage, the heartbreak, remain suspended in the air of a small Ohio town that will never again be the same.